My name was John Williams, but everyone knew me as Jack. Today, at the age of 97, I can still feel the biting cold of altitude in my bones when I think back to that fateful day in 1944. As a B-17 pilot in the U.S. 8th Air Force, I completed 12 missions over German territory. The 13th would change my life forever. Our crew was like a family. Mike O'Connor, my co-pilot, an Irishman from Boston with a sense of humor that kept us sane in the midst of chaos. Frank Martinez, our navigator, had an almost supernatural precision with maps and calculations. In the nose of the aircraft, David Cohen, our bombardier, was meticulous in every aspect of his work. The gunners, Pete Anderson, Robert Miller, and the Wilson brothers, George and Harold, were young, but lethal when necessary. Charlie Thompson, our radio operator, maintained our connection with the outside world. That October morning, we took off from the base at Thorpe Abbotts, England, as part of a formation of 24 bombers. Our mission was to hit a munitions factory near Hamburg. The briefing had been clear. We expected heavy resistance from the Luftwaffe and significant anti-aircraft defense. During the initial climb, I observed the familiar instrument panel of the Lucky Lady, as we had christened our flying fortress. Every dial, every switch was an extension of my own body after hundreds of hours in the cockpit. The roar of the four Wright Cyclone engines was our constant music, a mechanical symphony that had long since become part of us. The formation settled at 27,000 feet. The thin air forced us to wear our oxygen masks, and the -40-degree cold penetrated through our heated suits. Through the windshield, I could see other flying fortresses, their silhouettes jagged against the European sky, like metal birds in a deadly dance. Bandits at 2 o'clock. Pete's voice cut through the silence on our headsets. The Messerschmitt Bf 109s appeared like silver arrows, their tracers cutting through the air towards us. Our formation closed ranks, creating an interwoven network of defensive firepower. The next few minutes were an inferno of metal and fire. Our machine guns spat death in all directions, while the German fighters made successive passes. The Lucky Lady shuddered with every blast from our guns, her engines roaring in protest at the violence of the combat. Then the first blow hit us. A burst of flak shook the aircraft, and alarms began to sound in the cockpit. Engine 3 losing power. I shouted to O'Connor, who was already adjusting the controls to compensate. But that was only the beginning. The second explosion was closer, and this time I felt the impact resonate through the entire structure of the bomber. Fragments of metal pierced the fuselage, and icy air invaded the cabin. "Fire in engine 2. Martinez's voice sounded desperate in my headphones. We were now in a critical situation. 2 engines compromised, altitude decreasing, and there were still several minutes to go before the bombs were dropped. The crew were waiting for my orders. Their lives depended on my decision. Abandoning the aircraft would mean leaving them at the mercy of enemy fighters during the parachute descent. Attempting an emergency landing in hostile territory was just as risky. The blood pulsed in my temples as I assessed our options. The instrument panel showed a grim story: oil pressure dropping, engine temperature rising dangerously. Charlie reported that our radio had been damaged, limiting our communication with the rest of the formation. "Jack, we need a decision now." O'Connor's voice was tense but controlled. Years of training together had allowed us to communicate volumes with few words. Through the windshield, I could see German territory stretching out below us, hostile and implacable. It was at that moment that I realized that the decision had already been made in my heart. Those men weren't just my crew, they were my responsibility, my family in the sky. We had flown together, fought together, and now our survival depended on staying together. "Prepare for emergency landing," I announced with a calm I didn't feel. Cohen, release the bombs in a secure area. Martinez, find a suitable field for landing. Wilson, report condition of rear fuselage. The answers came quickly, professionally, confident in my leadership. As I began the emergency procedures, a strange peace enveloped me. The Lucky Lady may have been injured, but she was still responding to commands. Now it was a race against time, against gravity, against fate. The horizon ahead held our uncertain future, But one thing I knew for sure, whatever the outcome, we would face it together. The story of what happened in the next few minutes would change our lives forever. But at that moment, suspended between heaven and earth, we were just 9 men fighting for survival, united by duty, courage, and the determination to get home. The fire in Engine 2 intensified, and black smoke began to obscure my vision through the windshield. At that moment, every second was precious. Our altitude kept dropping, and I could feel the lucky lady struggling against gravity, like a wounded bird trying to stay in the air. Open field at 3 kilometers, heading northeast, Martinez shouted over the intercom. It appears to be a rural area, with no visible anti-aircraft defenses. My hands gripped the controls tightly as I maneuvered our damaged flying fortress. Repetitive training in emergency simulations was now becoming our only hope of survival. Every move had to be calculated, every decision potentially fatal. "Charlie, send up our last known position," I ordered. "Even with the radio damaged, maybe some signal will reach the base." The young radio operator nodded, his fingers dancing over the equipment in a desperate attempt to establish contact. O'Connor, my faithful co-pilot, remained focused on the instruments. "Hydraulic pressure dropping, Jack. Flaps may not respond when we need them." His normally cheerful Irish voice now carried a tone of controlled concern. "Cohen, have all the bombs been released?" I asked, needing to be absolutely sure before any landing attempt. "Affirmative, Captain. Bomb bay empty and locked," replied our bomber, his professional voice masking the fear we were all feeling. The German landscape was fast approaching. The field that Martinez had identified was beginning to take shape, a relatively flat expanse of cultivated land. It wasn't an airstrip, but it was our best chance. The Wilson brothers reported that the rear of the aircraft was sustaining significant damage, but the main structure still looked intact. "Prepare for emergency landing," I announced. "Everyone assume impact position. Miller, make sure the fire extinguishers are within reach." Engine 2 finally gave way, exploding in a fireball that shook the entire aircraft. The lucky lady began to pitch dangerously to the right, and it took all my strength to keep her level. O'Connor immediately cut power to the damaged engine, while I struggled to compensate with the 2 remaining engines. 300 feet, Martinez warned. Field approaching fast. Sweat dripped from under my helmet as I concentrated on keeping our approach as stable as possible. The landing gear was partially damaged. We would have to land on our bellies. "Brace for impact," I shouted, knowing that the next few moments would define our fate. The first touch was violent. Metal against earth, a deafening symphony of destruction. Sparks flew as the fuselage scraped the ground, tearing a deep trail in the German earth. I felt the impact reverberating throughout my body, the controls shaking in my hands with enough force to break bones. "Hold on," I shouted over the chaos. The speed slowed, but every meter seemed like an eternity. A farm fence was fast approaching, our last barrier. With one last effort on the controls, I managed to keep the trajectory straight, preventing us from rolling over. When we finally stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. Only the crackle of the flames in the engine and the groans of the tortured metal structure broke the surreal stillness. "Everyone report status," I ordered, already unbuckling my seatbelt. One by one, my crew responded. Miraculously, we were all alive, although some with minor injuries. Martinez had a cut on his forehead, and Pete Anderson had hurt his arm, but nothing serious enough to prevent us from moving. "We need to evacuate immediately," I instructed, helping O'Connor to his feet. "Take only the essentials, survival kits, weapons, and important documents. We have to get away before that fuel tank explodes." As we organized our hasty evacuation, I couldn't help but glance one last time at the lucky lady's instrument panel. This aircraft had been our home, our protector for 12 successful missions. Now it lay wounded on enemy soil, an aluminum giant defeated but not vanquished. "Come on, Jack," O'Connor pulled me by the arm. "No time for goodbyes." He was right, of course. Our survival now depended on moving quickly and finding shelter. We could hear vehicle engines in the distance, probably German patrols investigating our fall. The real challenge was just beginning. With my crew assembled, we did one last check of equipment and injuries. 9 men, united by fate and adversity, about to begin a journey through enemy territory. I looked at each of them. Young faces smeared with soot and sweat, eyes determined and confident despite the imminent danger. "Follow me," I ordered, taking the lead of the group. "Stay together and keep quiet. We'll find a way back home." As we drove away from the smoking wreckage of the Lucky Lady, I knew that our true test of courage and endurance had only just begun. The war had knocked us down, but not yet defeated us. Our story of survival was far from over. The distant sound of German engines plunged us into the dense vegetation of a small wood near the wreckage of the Lucky Lady. Our hearts were racing as we watched 3 military vehicles approaching the crash site. Martinez, with his knowledge of German, was able to pick up fragments of the soldiers' conversations. "They're organizing a systematic search of the area," he whispered. "They believe we survived the landing." O'Connor checked our supplies. Some emergency rations, canteens with water, 2 compasses and a damaged map of the area. Our service pistols and some ammunition completed our limited arsenal. Charlie Thompson still carried his small portable emergency radio, hoping to get some contact with the Allied forces. "We need to move during the night," I instructed my crew. "Martinez, what's our best route to Allied territory?" Our navigator studied the map in the dim light of dusk. "The Dutch border is approximately 80 kilometers to the west. If we keep a good pace and avoid the main roads, we can get there in 3 or 4 days." The night fell like a protective cloak over us. Pete Anderson, his arm still bruised, was biting his lip to contain the pain as we moved silently through the hostile territory. The Wilson brothers took up surveillance positions at the rear of the group, their experiences as hunters in Montana proving invaluable. During our first night's march, we crossed abandoned farm fields and small woods. Every sound, a broken branch, a nocturnal animal, made us stop and seek cover. Fear was our constant companion, but the determination to survive was even greater. At dawn on the second day, Cohen identified a farm that appeared to be abandoned. We needed shelter and, more importantly, information about German patrols in the area. With extreme caution, we approached the structure. "Jack," whispered O'Connor, "there's smoke coming out of the chimney." I signaled for everyone to stay in position while Martinez and I approached the house. Before we could reach the door, it opened. An elderly woman stared at us, her wrinkled face showing more curiosity than fear. To our surprise, she gestured for us to enter quickly. Martinez spoke to her briefly in German. "She's part of the local resistance," he explained. "She's been helping downed airmen escape." Helga, as she introduced herself, offered us shelter in her barn and crucial information about troop movements in the region. Through Martinez, she told us about a network of farmers and citizens who were risking themselves to help Allied soldiers return to their lines. "The German patrols are concentrated on the main roads," Martinez translated. "She suggests we follow a dry riverbed that will lead us to a Dutch resistance post." While we rested in the barn, Charlie tried to establish contact with our command via the radio. "I managed to pick up some Allied transmissions," he reported. "They know we've been shot down. There are rescue teams on alert." Helga's hospitality was our first moment of hope since the crash. She provided us with provisions and civilian clothes to replace our flashy uniforms. More importantly, she gave us a new detailed map of the region. However, our sense of security was short-lived. On the afternoon of the second day, the sound of approaching motorcycles alerted us. A German patrol was arriving at the farm. "Quick, into the cellar," Helga gestured frantically. We hid in a secret compartment under the floor of the barn, our hearts hammering as we heard German boots above us. For 20 agonizing minutes, we remained motionless, each second seeming like an eternity. When the vehicles finally left, we emerged from our hiding place knowing that we had to leave immediately. The risk to Helga was too great. "Danke." I thanked our savior, one of the few German words I knew. She hugged us, tears in her eyes, and handed Martinez a small medallion. "She says this will identify us to other members of the resistance," he translated. We set off at dusk, our chances of survival significantly improved thanks to the kindness of a stranger in enemy territory. The road ahead was still dangerous, but now we had a plan and invisible allies. As I led my crew through the darkness, I reflected on how war revealed both the worst and the best of humanity. Amid the destruction and hatred, there were still people like Helga, willing to risk everything to help strangers. Freedom was just days away, but the real challenge had only just begun. Our journey through occupied Germany would test not only our physical endurance, but also our ability to trust each other and strangers who could be our salvation or our downfall. Following the dry riverbed as instructed by Helga, our journey became increasingly dangerous. The third day on the run began with an alarming discovery. Fresh footprints and cigarette butts indicated the recent presence of German patrols. "They're closing in," whispered O'Connor as we examined the tracks. "They must have set up a search perimeter after finding the lucky lady." Martinez translated the headlines from an abandoned newspaper we'd found. "German forces have intensified their search for downed Allied airmen. They are offering rewards to the civilian population for information." The news forced us to change our strategy. We could no longer rely on the cover of the woods. We had to blend in with the population. The civilian clothes provided by Helga would be our only protection. "Let's split up into 3 groups," I decided after consulting the map. "We'll attract less attention. Martinez, you lead a group with Cohen and Pete. O'Connor, you go with Charlie and George Wilson. Harold Wilson comes with me." We set up meeting points along the way and agreed on signs. Charlie handed out small radio crystals he had improvised. They wouldn't allow communication, but they would help us pick up Allied transmissions for guidance. My group took the most northerly route. Harold Wilson proved to be a valuable companion. This training as a hunter allowed us to avoid several patrols. During a rest stop, he shared with me his concerns about his brother. "George has never flown without me before, Captain," he said quietly. "Ever since we were little, we've always protected each other. O'Connor will take care of him," I assured him, although I understood his apprehension. War had the power to separate even the strongest bonds. On the morning of the 4th day, we witnessed something I will never forget. From our elevated position, we saw a column of prisoners being escorted by German soldiers. They were civilians, probably Jews or members of the resistance. Among them, I recognized Helga's wrinkled face. My heart sank. Our benefactor had been discovered. The impulse to try to help her was immense, but we knew that any attempt would be suicidal. Harold grabbed my arm, anticipating my reaction. "We can't save her, Jack," he whispered. "She knew the risks when she helped us." That was the hardest decision of our entire escape. To continue on our way, carrying the weight of guilt for abandoning someone who risked everything for us. Helga's face would join the many others that would haunt my sleepless nights for years to come. At the designated meeting point, we found O'Connor and his group. They were wounded but alive. They had come up against a German patrol and narrowly escaped. George Wilson had a graze wound on his shoulder, but insisted that he could continue. "Martinez and the others?" I asked, dreading the answer. "No sign yet," replied O'Connor, wiping dried blood from a cut on his forehead. "But they know the alternative route. They'll meet us at the next point." The next few hours were increasingly tense. Every minute of delay increased the possibility that Martinez's group had been captured. Charlie managed to pick up fragments of German communication on his makeshift radio. The search was intensifying. When we finally reached the next rendezvous point, we found only a piece of paper hidden under a rock. Cohen's hasty handwriting read, "Following Route B. Pete injured. Rendezvous at the border." "At least they're alive," murmured O'Connor, but his voice betrayed concern. The Dutch border was close now, less than a day's walk, but it was also where German surveillance would be most intense. We needed to cross an open area, without cover, protected only by darkness. Tonight, I decided, we'll cross with the new moon. While we waited for nightfall, I shared the last rations with my reduced team. Tiredness was visible on every face, but there was also determination. We had come too far to fail now. "If anything happens to me," I instructed, "O'Connor takes over. The priority is to reach the Allied lines with the information we have on the German defenses." Charlie checked his radio one last time. "Captain, I picked up an Allied transmission. There's a rescue operation underway. They're looking for us on the other side of the border." That news renewed our hopes. Freedom was only a few hours away, but it would be the most dangerous hours of our journey. As the sun set, I couldn't help but think of Martinez, Cohen, and Pete, somewhere out there, also preparing for their last attempt at escape. Night came, bringing with it the darkness that would be our ally or our doom. It was time to find out if the luck that had accompanied us so far would continue to be on our side. The moonless night offered us the best chance of crossing the border, but it also made our navigation more difficult. With O'Connor, Charlie, and the Wilson brothers, we moved like ghosts across the open terrain, each step calculated to avoid any sound that might give us away. My thoughts kept returning to Martinez, Cohen, and Pete. Somewhere in that darkness, they too were fighting for their lives. As commander, the responsibility for each of them weighed on my shoulders like lead. The silence was broken by the distant sound of barking dogs. "Patrol with guard dogs," whispered Harold Wilson. "They're approaching from the south." We ducked into a shallow ditch, barely breathing as the German voices came closer. Charlie clutched his makeshift radio to his chest, afraid that any static might give us away. The barking grew closer. Then we heard shots in the distance coming from the east. The Germans immediately redirected their patrol to investigate. "It must be Martinez's group," muttered O'Connor. "They're creating a distraction for us." The realization of the sacrifice our comrades were possibly making hit us like a punch. But we couldn't let their efforts be in vain. Seizing the opportunity, we accelerated our progress towards the border. After an hour of constant movement, Charlie picked up something on his radio. Signals in Morse code, he whispered excitedly. "It's ours. They're coordinating search operations less than 3 kilometers from here." Renewed hope gave us extra strength, but fate had other plans. A sudden searchlight cut through the darkness, and German voices shouted orders to surrender. We had stumbled upon a hidden outpost. "Scatter," I ordered, pushing Charlie into the nearest cover. Gunfire cut through the air as we split up, each running in a different direction. Training took over, zigzagging, staying low, looking for cover. A nearby explosion threw me to the ground. Through the confusion, I saw George Wilson return to help his fallen brother. O'Connor was somewhere to my right, providing covering fire with his pistol. "Jack," Charlie's voice rang out through the chaos. "The coordinates. I need to transmit our position." I crawled over to him, dictating the numbers while keeping watch. Charlie worked frantically on his radio, his hands shaking but determined. A projectile hit the ground nearby, dropping dirt on us. It was then that we heard the sweetest sound possible, the roar of approaching aircraft engines. "Mosquitoes from the RAF," shouted O'Connor. "The bastards have really come." British aircraft began machine gunning German positions, forcing them to seek cover. We took advantage of the confusion to regroup. The Wilson brothers appeared from the shadows, Harold limping but alive. "Now or never," I declared. "The border must be less than a kilometer away." We ran as we had never run before, ignoring the exhaustion and pain. The mosquitoes continued their attack, keeping the Germans busy. Through the darkness, we began to see lights, signs of the Dutch resistance. And then, like a mirage in the desert, 3 figures appeared in front of us. Martinez, Cohen, and Pete, bruised but alive. They had managed to get around the German patrols and reach us. "We couldn't let you have all the fun," smiled Martinez, despite the dried blood on his face. United again, the 9 crew members of the Lucky Lady crossed the border to freedom together. Members of the Dutch resistance welcomed us with hugs and tears of joy. Our odyssey was over. In the following weeks, each of us would be debriefed, our information on German defenses proving invaluable to the war effort. But what I remember most about those days are not the reports or the medals. I remember Helga, whose sacrifice allowed us to escape, the farmers and ordinary citizens who risked everything to help us, the courage of my crew, who refused to abandon each other even in the most desperate circumstances. Today, so many decades later, when I think back to that 13th mission, I don't think of the lost aircraft or the terror of the escape. I think of the bonds forged in the heat of combat, the humanity we found in enemy territory, and the determination that brought us home. Of the 9 men who survived that adventure, only I am still alive to tell our story. But as long as there is someone to listen, the legacy of the Lucky Lady and her brave crew will live on. Not as a war story, but as a testament to the power of courage, loyalty, and hope even in the darkest moments. And perhaps, somewhere beyond our comprehension, Helga will smile, knowing that her sacrifice was not in vain. That 9 young Americans found their way home, carrying with them eternal gratitude and the promise never to forget those left behind.